Good afternoon and thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. During the past legislative session, Vermont lawmakers approved and Governor Shumlin signed into law Act 39. Act 39 is the patient choice and control at the end of life law. The end of life law has generated questions like how does it work or who can participate? So our goal this afternoon is to provide the facts about the law, and to do so we've called on two experts. Joining me are Cindy Brzezzi, who is the Executive Director of the Vermont Ethics Network, and Dr. Bob McCauley, who is the Director of Medical Ethics at Fletcher Allen Healthcare and a professor at the University of Vermont's College of Medicine. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Let's start with a basic question. Cindy, what is Act 39?
Well, as you said, Act 39 is a new law that was passed on May 20th of this year, and it makes it legal for a terminally ill, capable adult patient to request and obtain a prescription for medication to hasten their death.
Mm-hmm. And so who's eligible under this new law? Who can participate?
So again, those kind of key phrases of terminally ill patients, so that means someone who has a life expectancy of 6 months or less, adult, someone over the age of 18, capable, that means they need to be able to make an informed decision and not have any impaired judgment. They also need to be a Vermont resident. They need to be under the care of a physician, and they also need to make a voluntary request in the physical presence of a physician for this medication to be self-administered.
And so, tell me a little bit about the process itself. I mean, we sort of went through the requirements and eligibility, but what's the first step that a person should take if they're under that umbrella?
The first step they need to take is to make an oral request to their physician, and that is in the physical presence of the physician. And then there's a waiting period between when they make the initial request and then when they make a subsequent follow-up second request. So that's a 15-day waiting period. They also need to make a written request. And so that request needs to be signed by the patient. It needs to be witnessed by two people who are not considered under the law interested persons.
So
and
like not maybe a family member.
Right, exactly. And then there's a series of other documentation process requirements that physicians need to do in terms of verifying the patient's diagnosis, their prognosis, and that kind of
And getting a second opinion to confirm that, and also to make sure that the patient is capable. If there's any concern about the patient's capability to make the decision, then there needs to be a referral to a mental health professional to make sure the patient really is capable of making the decision.
And so from a physician's standpoint, Dr. McCauley, this obviously is a pretty narrow skew as far as patients. I mean,
yes.
That would make these different criteria.
Well, it's a narrow subset of patients who qualify in the first place. And in the lead up to the passage of this law, with lots of debate going on about whether to pass it or not, I got a lot of questions from people who wouldn't have qualified under the law saying, I want to use the law if it ever happens. And I was forced to say, well, even if it gets passed, you or the person you describe wouldn't qualify. So for instance, a patient with advanced dementia who can't make their own decisions at that time wouldn't qualify under the law. And the other piece is, even if you do qualify under the law, something that I often say to people is, will you write me a lethal prescription shouldn't be a yes or no question to a physician. It should be, well, let's take a bit of a step back. Let's talk about what's driving you to ask for this. Are you getting optimal palliative care? Are you getting the concerns that you have addressed adequately? So that rather than jumping ahead to say, oh, yes, I will, or no, I won't, what is driving you to ask for this, and how can we help you in the big picture?
Because it's really something very obviously serious to consider, and to take a step back and to look at exactly what it is that you want to accomplish here.
Exactly. So I think that when patients are asking for this, when they do, some of them are just exploring options to say, I've heard about this, what does this mean for me? Maybe they have needs that haven't been adequately addressed, and this is the only thing they can think of that will help them. Or there may be people who have exhausted all other options and have made a thoughtful choice. And I think it's important to distinguish between those three groups.
And so what if the doctor doesn't want to prescribe the medicine?
No one's under any obligation to use the law. No patient is under any obligation if they're terminally ill to use the law. No physician is under any obligation if a patient asks them for a lethal prescription to write one. So everyone has an opportunity to opt out if they don't want to participate both on the patient level and on the physician level.
And can someone change their mind once they start the process?
They can change their mind at any time during the process, and certainly from other states who have a law similar to ours, we've seen that in the data that they've collected over the years, that some patients obtain a prescription but they never use it. And some patients begin the process, and then as soon as they get tapped into available resources, good palliative care support, hospice support, they find that whatever needs or worries they have are being well managed, and then they no longer pursue the option. So I think at any time a patient can change their mind.
Mm-hmm. And so I think that's interesting to point out too, that you've looked at what other states have done in this situation, and what have you found?
Well, I think the state that has the most data that we've been able to look at, and certainly that portions of our law was modeled after, is the state of Oregon. And so what we find in Oregon is that I think in the last 15 years that option has been available in that state. There's been 1,050 patients who've obtained prescriptions, and I think the data was about 670 patients who actually use them. So you do see that people, they like the idea of knowing they have this perhaps, but it doesn't mean that they feel any obligation necessarily to even use it.
And so how should someone go about initiating a conversation with his or her physician about the topic?
Well, I think it's part of a bigger topic. So if someone is facing terminal illness, they need to talk to their physician to say, what are my options here in terms of getting my concerns addressed? What are my worries? What are my goals? And how can I achieve those? Ideally, there would be consultation with a palliative care specialist who can help walk that patient and the physician who's taking care of that patient primarily through the process of saying, what are your goals? What are your hopes? How can we help you live fully for as long as you're able to live? And only then, if it turns out that the patient says, well, I really want to avail myself of this law, when all the other concerns have been addressed, then at that point, the physician has the option of participating if he or she chooses to do so. And that's up to the professional discretion of the physician whether they want to do that.
And where do family members fit in with this decision? Do they have any say at all? Husband, wife, or children?
Not necessarily. So the Oregon law has a component that says ideally the family would be involved, but it's obviously up to the patient. From a patient confidentiality point of view, a physician can encourage a patient to include their family in the discussion, but if the patient chooses not to, they don't have to.
And so how does the end-of-life law mesh with advanced directives?
Well, I think that's been a very common question from everyone. Can I put something, my wish about this particular new option in my advance directive? And I guess the short answer to that question is no. And I think you look back to who qualifies for this law. And again, it gets back to the person who's capable of making an informed decision at the time that they're making this request for a prescription. And we know from advance directives when those really kick in and when we're looking at those are when patients no longer have the capacity to make their own decisions. That's not to say that patients in the course of exploring their own goals and values, their preferences and their priorities about their end-of-life care wishes couldn't indicate where they stand on this particular issue to provide some context should a situation arise where this might lead someone or an agent to know that, well, this person isn't interested in burdensome life-prolonging measures if the quality of life isn't sufficient. But in terms of having a healthcare agent execute this decision on someone else's behalf, that can't happen.
And so what are some of the other questions that you hear from people when you bring this topic up or when you're discussing this?
Well, I think for me, one of the questions that I get is this, for many people, seems to be their only option, or that's the only thing that they think of. And I think Cindy's point about advanced directives is really important, which is to say that many patients who are facing terminal illness, this is not their only option, that patients have the right to refuse treatment. So I wouldn't want patients to think that they have two choices, namely maximal treatment and devoted towards life prolongation or getting a lethal prescription. There's a huge area in the middle, and patients for decades in our country have had the right to refuse life-sustaining treatment if they wanted to do that. So whether that's intensive care or whether that's medication that's necessary to sustain their life, there are a lot of options that patients have along the way that wouldn't necessarily require them to use the law. So I think that the big piece that I would stress to patients is not to reduce palliative care or end-of-life choices simply to Act 39. Act 39 is an element that is now on the table for discussion since it was legalized, but there are a lot of other options that have been there for a long time that people have been using and that meet patients' needs in other ways.
And I think the big opportunity here about questions is really to engage in a discussion about people's goals and values around end-of-life care, treatment options, what their preferences are. And I think this is, in some ways, the silver lining of this law has been that it's really prompted and sparked a new discussion and an earlier conversation with patients and families about how they feel about these issues, which hopefully will lead to an increase in advanced directives being completed in advance of a crisis or critical illness, and better utilization of the tools we have available also to document patient preferences.
Well, I think that's an interesting point because we've talked before about the same issues. People just don't even think about this aspect of their life until they're right in the middle of it.
Right.
Which is the wrong time to start making some really big decisions if you're sick.
Exactly, and I think families struggle with that too, not having had a conversation with their loved one about what their preferences are in advance. And so I think this is a really good opportunity to begin to have that discussion and really to inform yourself about all of the options. We have tremendous hospice and palliative care services across the state through a variety of different ways to obtain that, and I think that there's just a huge opportunity to really get people informed as to what's out there that can really help them as they're navigating this end-of-life journey.
And so we have a few minutes left, and I think it would be helpful to review some of the key points about the new law. So first, is this a yes or no issue?
This is not a yes or no issue, and I think Dr. McCauley had said that when someone asks a question about this, that is not the answer, yes or no. It really should be a springboard to further discussion about what their fears and concerns are and how you can support them in the questions that they have.
And so obviously there might be a lot of issues leading up to that patient asking you this question. Yes.
So there's a question of whether the patient even qualifies under the law. There's a question of what's driving the patient to ask that question. Is it a sense of feeling that they're abandoned? Is there a sense of feeling like there's no hope? Is there a feeling like there's nowhere else to go with regard to symptom management? There's so many reasons why people ask that question. And I think that trying to figure out what those reasons are and bringing all our tools to bear to try to help those patients is really the most important thing, rather than just simply saying, yes, I'm willing to, or no, I'm not willing to.
And of course, another key component of this is that nobody is obligated to participate.
That's correct. All participation is voluntary. So that's true for patients, for physicians, for pharmacists who may or may not want to fill this prescription, for nurses who may be attending to the care of someone at the bedside. This is all an option that they can choose whether or not they want to be involved with it or not.
Something to think about.
Certainly.
And so obviously then another key point is that this may be a really good time to have those discussions with family members and even, I suppose, physicians too.
Certainly.
Well, I think physicians could do better in terms of initiating these conversations, and it's hard. The best time to have these conversations is when someone is relatively healthy and isn't facing these decisions in an acute time frame. But we have busy schedules and we have time pressures, and there are all kinds of different forces at play. And also, patients may not want to talk about it. So you have a physician who has got a lot of other pressures, and we're all human, and patients oftentimes don't want to talk about their mortality. But as Cindy said, this has brought the conversation more out into the open. So hopefully we'll use that momentum to really have some substantive conversations about what patients want.
Okay. I know, too, there are a number of resources, Cindy, that you wanted to talk a little bit about for people who may have more questions about this.
Sure. And, our website, the Vermont Ethics Network website, is one place that folks can go, and it's up there on the screen, both the phone number as well as the website, where we've got quite a bit of information up there just explaining what the law says, so people can get information there. The Department of Health also has put information up on their website, and it's up on the screen as well. They have forms too that patients can look at as for the written request, as we mentioned earlier, which is part of the process if they want to utilize that. Patient Choices Vermont is a local grassroots organization that was the advocacy organization behind the passage of this law. They are available too to answer questions, as well as Compassion and Choices, which is a national organization, and they've set up a 1-800 number with folks who are informed about Vermont's law that can also be a resource for folks who have questions.
Right, and I think it's interesting to point out too that this is a good chance to have those conversations before something happens, even with, I would assume, your older parents, to find out where they stand on some of these issues.
Yeah.
And not just with your older parents. I think everybody should be having these conversations with their physicians and with the people that they love and are going to trust to help them make decisions when the time comes.
Because the time will come.
For all of us.
For all of us.
Which is something that no one likes to think about.
That's
but
true.
We plan for everything else in life. So I want to thank you both for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
That's our program for today. Thanks for joining us. I'll see you again next time on Across the Fence.
For a video copy of today's program, call toll-free 1-888-ATF-3430. Across the Fence is brought to you as a public service by University of Vermont Extension and WCAX TV.